cool with you?
It's cool with me. Don, you?
We're up and running.
Okay. Well, hello, I'm Garry Brenner. I'm with the Convention of States Project. Thank you for coming here. I really appreciate it, and I'm excited to be here. The Convention of States Project is a grassroots organization at its core. And by grassroots, in case you don't know, I mean that it's an organization organized at the basic level, at the ground level, so to speak, with everyday people like us. And by basic, I don't mean unimportant. I don't mean simple. I don't mean that it's anything less than good. But grassroots is, in fact, is an extremely important part of our society. Grassroots activity plays a very important role. So, Convention of States is not only a grassroots organization, but it's a movement of American people. And it's growing, and it's a thriving movement. Project began in 2013, just over 5 years ago. And since then, the growth of and spreading of Convention of States has been quite remarkable. We are active in all 50 states. In fact, we have supporters and volunteers in every state legislative district in the entire nation. And that's something that's very uncommon for organizations of this type, to have that type of popularity and saturation within that amount of time. So my talk is going to be basically in two parts. And the first part is going to sound a little gloomy. So I just want to forewarn you. But there's a good reason for that, and it's fact-based gloom. It's reality-based gloom. The second part of the talk is going to be of a positive, constructive nature and a hope-filled nature. So why Convention of States? So let me talk about me first a little bit. I was never active in politics until 3 years ago when I joined Convention of States. My interests were elsewhere. I always voted, but besides voting, I was never an active participant in any kind of political activities. Although I kept an interest in it from afar, and my interest over time grew gradually as I watched things developing, and I was becoming more and more concerned with issues in our country. Political issues, governing issues, and it's just more and more was apparent to me that we've got some real serious problems in America with our politics and with our governing structure. And I started thinking along the way that maybe I need to try and help rather than just voting. Maybe I need to do something more than voting, but I didn't know what that was. I had no idea what more I could do. I didn't think I was really a good candidate for political office. I didn't think that's where I could help. And then I started hearing about Convention of States on the radio from Mark Levin, who's a popular radio and now TV host, in case you don't know Mark Levin. He wrote a book a few years ago called The Liberty Amendments. And that book helped to inspire Convention of States. Around the same time, there was a grassroots activist with the Tea Party movement. He was an early founder of the Tea Party movement named Mark Meckler. And Mark Meckler hooked up with another man named Michael Farris, who is a well-known, renowned attorney and educator. And Mark Meckler and Michael Farris started thinking about starting this organization, Citizens for Self-Governance, which is the parent organization of Convention of States. And their goal was to get something, to get the federal government back under control, back within its constitutional limits, because it was apparent to them that the federal government was no longer operating within its constitutional limits, and that it was basically out of control. It was detached from the Constitution, no longer being faithful to the original Constitution as the framers intended. And Mark Meckler and Michael Farris became aware of Mark Levin's book. They got in touch with Mark. The three of them got in touch together and kind of combined forces to begin this Convention of States project 5 years ago. So let me ask you a question, a couple of questions at this point. How many of you before now have heard of Convention of States project? You're very familiar with it? Somewhat familiar with it? Okay. And then any of you never heard of Convention of States before this evening? You had never heard of it at all before. Okay. Good. And how many of you have ever heard before tonight, have ever heard of Article 5 of the Constitution, and you're somewhat familiar with it, or very familiar with it? A couple of shaky hands. But none of you have never heard of Article, you've all heard of Article 5 at least. Okay, good. All right, how many of you, when you're watching the news on TV about politics and government, you yell at the TV or you throw something at the TV? Okay, me too. All right, so why Convention of States? What's the purpose of the Convention of States project? Why do we need it? I think a lot of us have a strong sense that we have some real serious problems in politics and governance. We know that the national debt is reported about, right now it's reported to be $21 trillion. You've ever heard some of these studies that help you get a perspective on what a trillion is? There's one that I heard recently that to count from 1 to 1 trillion at the rate of one number per second, how long do you think that would take? Take a guess? In years. That's good though, a trillion seconds. All right, it would take 30,000 years to count to a trillion. And beyond the national debt at 21 trillion, they say that our unfunded liabilities, public pensions, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, run over $100 trillion. So most reasonable experts agree on this, that level of debt is unsustainable, meaning that America cannot continue on with running that level of debt and growing the debt that it's been growing at before something calamitous happens, before a complete collapse happens. So obviously that's a huge, huge problem. And more so for the younger generations to come, it's a greater and greater problem. And we're kind of in a national state of denial about this problem, which is kind of understandable. It's monumental, and it's just psychologically speaking, it's easier just to put it off on the future generations, keep borrowing and mortgaging future generations. But at the same time, that really is an immoral choice. There's a strong morality issue with this. So that's something that really needs to be dealt with. And there's some other problems though that we should deal with and we need to deal with. For example, there's the issue of liberty and freedom. We know that our country was founded on those principles in large part. But as government grows, and government has been growing very steeply over the last 120 years, growing out of control, many believe. As that happens, I think you have a sense that we lose liberty at the same time. The more government grows, the more we lose liberty, individual liberty. As government grows, power centralizes with the federal government. And as it's centralizing with the federal government, it's going away from the individual, away from the states. And in large part, the American people, we are partly responsible for that. We're allowing that to happen. But we do have some choice in the matter. It's not like we have no choice in that matter. The framers of the Constitution envisioned some of these things happening, by the way. And it's because of their education that they envisioned it, from their experiences with the tyranny from England that they lived through. And after they threw off the tyranny from England, then the framers of our Constitution dealt with this loose band of colonies, 13 colonies, which were loosely connected, but there was no central authority to kind of organize that connection and manage it. So there was a lot of strife between, and serious strife between the 13 colonies. So the framers were fresh from dealing with that also. And the framers knew that they had to come up with a form of government that was able to balance those different competing needs for liberty and freedom of the individual, but also to have an orderly society and a group of new states that could live together side by side, orderly and peacefully. So that was heavily on the mind of the framers when they were thinking about how to organize this new country that they were developing. Initially, we had a constitution called the Articles of Confederation, and there were serious inadequacies with the Articles of Confederation. The Articles were not adequate to having this society and country that the framers wanted to build. So the framers realized at a certain point they had to correct the Articles of Confederation. So they held conferences and meetings throughout the colonies on how to do this. One famous conference was the Annapolis Conference in Maryland, where they discussed how to fix the Articles of Confederation. And they decided that, well, for one thing, there was not enough attendees at the Annapolis conference. They didn't have a quorum of delegates there. So they decided they would schedule another conference in Philadelphia, down the road a little bit. And that became the Constitutional Convention in 1787, attended by 12 of the 13 colonies. Only Rhode Island did not attend and participate in the Constitutional Convention. So one of the things they talked about in the convention was how to amend the Constitution that they were developing in the future. When it would be discovered that things needed to be changed, they needed a way to fix them and to do amendments down the road, things that they could not foresee. So they came up with a plan to have Congress propose amendments, and that the states would then ratify amendments as needed. And the other part of that plan was to have the states apply to Congress for amendments that the states thought were needed. So that was kind of in place almost till the very end of the Constitution, till the end of the convention. And right towards the end of the convention, George Mason from Virginia brought up a problem that he saw. He said, we're giving the Congress a way to fix the Constitution, but what if the Congress becomes the problem itself? What if the Congress becomes oppressive, doesn't represent the people any longer the way they're supposed to? They're not going to fix themselves if they're the problem. And yes, the states can apply for amendments to Congress, but if Congress is the problem, again, they're probably going to finagle those proposals. So George Mason said we need to give the states a way to propose amendments completely on their own, circumvent Congress, do it without Congress's input whatsoever, without their approval. So that was proposed, and it was unanimously agreed to. And that method of the states being able to propose amendments in a convention is referred to sometimes as the Article 5 convention process. The delegates all unanimously agreed to that without dissent. And we know that from James Madison's notes of the convention. James Madison took extremely detailed notes throughout the whole convention of the 4 months, May through September of 1787. And he virtually didn't miss a thing. There was a rare occasion when he missed in his notes about certain motions here and there. Otherwise, this is an extraordinary historical record that we still have today and extremely valuable. We also have other historical record that is extremely valuable. For instance, the Federalist Papers, which tell us a lot about what the framers meant in the Constitution, what their intentions were by various articles, various clauses. That's extremely valuable to help with interpreting what the framers meant in the Constitution. The problem, though, a big part of the problem is that over the years, parts of the Constitution have been misinterpreted by the courts in large part and by Congress to give much more power to Congress than the framers intended. And it's been a very gradual process over the last 120 years. For example, the Commerce Clause in Article 1 of the Constitution. The Commerce Clause has been misinterpreted drastically over the years by the federal courts and the Supreme Court to give great power to Congress that it really wasn't meant to have. So that's something that we're hoping to address in the Convention of States project, fixing some of those problems. So to give you a little more about the nuts and bolts and mechanics of the Convention of States project, Article 5, let me see if I can recite Article 5 for you. The Congress, the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or upon the application of 2/3 of the legislatures of the several states. And then it talks about, that's the first part of Article 5. And then it talks about either of those methods, the proposed amendments are then sent to the states for ratification and requires to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures or by ratification conventions in each state. And it says that the ratification mode can be proposed by Congress. Either ratification mode can be proposed by Congress. So Convention of States is focused on using that second method for proposing amendments. The states get together in a convention, a meeting of commissioners from every state. And at the convention, at the Article 5 convention, the commissioners discuss their ideas for amendments. They propose those ideas, debate them. Maybe there's people who will motion to change it this way, change it that way, and then they vote on them. And either the voting passes the proposed amendment or it doesn't. At the convention, at the Article 5 convention, each state gets one vote. The states can have as many delegates there, as many commissioners there as they want, but it's one vote, one state. It requires a simple majority of states to pass a proposed amendment to send back to the states for ratification. And then it's up to the states either to ratify the proposed amendment or not. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts mechanics of the process. By the way, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to ask. We have the group is a good size where we can do questions along the way. And we often hear people say, you may have heard them say, if we would only follow the Constitution. Have you heard people say that we wouldn't have these problems, or we wouldn't have a lot of these problems if we just followed the Constitution? So a legitimate question, though, for that is, which Constitution are we talking about? Because we really have two constitutions. We have the original one that was ratified back in 1787 and soon afterwards. We also have the Constitution that has been amended and annotated by the courts. And that annotated Constitution, which has all the federal and Supreme Court cases included in it, interpreting the original Constitution, is published in a book by the government. And that book is roughly 3,000 pages long. It's like this thick, if you've ever seen it. So that's the Constitution that Congress is going by, more or less, today. And it's very, very different than the original. And that includes that Commerce Clause that I mentioned that's been so abused and misinterpreted. So our approach is to address these problems at a convention where representatives, commissioners from the states can propose amendments. And these amendments can be the structural changes that are needed now to fix these problems. So in other words, we have, in large part, a structural problem with our governance, as well as a personnel issue. Elections have to do with personnel. And yes, it's vitally important and imperative that we continue electing the best candidates for office. That's never changed, and it's always going to be the case. But elections are not enough, and that's been proven. Even more so recently, it's been proven that elections are not enough. In 2010, we swept, Republicans swept the House of Representatives and the Senate. Nothing much changed, though, as a result of that. And now we have the presidency. Republicans have the presidency, that is. And President Trump is doing his best, I believe. But President Trump is really limited. No president really can make those long-term structural changes that we need. We've had presidents that have tried over the last 100 years to try to limit the growth of government, and even slow its growth. Calvin Coolidge, actually the only president to reduce the operating budget. William Howard Taft tried to limit the growth of government. More recently, President Reagan. Yet, despite that, we are where we are, with ever skyrocketing national debt, growing central government by leaps and bounds. So that, again, points to this need for us to make some structural changes, and for the American people acting through their state legislators to use this tool the framers gave us, this Article 5 convention process. And you can think of it as it's we the people, as the framers put right at the beginning of the Constitution, we the people are, in a sense, reclaiming our power that the framers gave us in the Constitution. Yes, Chris?
The question is kind of minutia. So you need 2/3 of the state legislatures to call a convention. And you need 2/3 of state legislatures to approve any amendment on the basis of that. So
just to little minor corrections in what you said. It's 2/3 of the state legislatures to apply to Congress for a convention. Yeah. It's kind of the language in there is they apply. To ratify any proposed amendments that come out of an Article 5 convention requires 3/4 of the states
3/4 of the states.
to ratify.
Okay.
So to apply, it's 2/3, and in today's numbers, which is 50 states, 2/3 would be 34 to apply. To ratify would require 38 states.
And does Congress, but this sidesteps Congress entirely.
Exactly.
And what percentage of the state, like, so 3/4 of state legislatures need to approve it, but is it up to the state legislature? Like, is it just a simple majority within the state legislatures to approve, or is it 2/3, or how does that work?
I think that may vary somewhat from one state to another, but I think in many, if not most states, it's a simple majority vote that it would be. I think that's a great question, though. So that's speaking of that, though, it brings up an interesting point. An important point is that those numbers, 2/3 and 3/4, are high standards to meet. They're difficult to meet those standards. And that's the framers did that for a reason. They didn't want this to happen easily and willy-nilly. They wanted, if this was going to happen, they wanted it to be a serious effort that had a good amount of support and that it should have that support based on the fact that they were able to get 2/3 to apply and 3/4 to ratify. And speaking of the 3/4 to ratify, that's 38 states. That means that only 13 states would have to say no to a proposed amendment to defeat it. So even if, let's say for hypothetical, if the convention produced some crazy amendment that was a bad amendment, like abolishing the Second Amendment, an amendment to abolish the Second Amendment, easily 13 states would defeat that amendment. So in other words, crazy amendments, it's almost impossible for a crazy amendment to be ratified because of that safety measure that the framers put in. Probably a crazy amendment would not even get to that stage. And in speaking of that, the Convention of States project is based on 3 subject areas. In other words, we're not proposing specific amendments in our application, but instead we're proposing 3 subject areas that the convention would have to stay within. Those 3 subject areas are to limit the size and power of the federal government, to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, and that is including spending limitations and taxing limitations. And the third area is to enact term limits on members of Congress, federal officials, including federal judges, and Supreme Court justices. Any of those things are fair game in our convention. Anything that doesn't fall within those 3 subject areas is not fair game in our convention, and commissioners cannot legally even propose amendments that don't fit in there. If they do, if there's say there's a rogue delegate commissioner who's proposing something crazy, that commissioner's state can recall them, and likely will recall them and say, you're out of there, we're replacing you. Beyond that, some states have legislation, criminal legislation for delegates that violate their instructions from the state. For instance, Indiana, their criminal penalties include possible jail time for delegates who violate their Article 5 instructions from their state.
But individual state legislatures determine this. Different states could choose to or to not impose restrictions.
No, because our application is uniform from one state to another. All the states that are considering and have passed our application, it's uniform, and it says those 3 subject areas. So they know going in that they passed an application that has 3 strict subject areas, and they will instruct their delegates of that as well. By the way, those 3 subject areas are on the back of my business card for your reference.
On the second subject you're talking about, I keep hearing an interesting argument that the government should be run without the goal of making a profit, instead of breaking even. special emphasis on efficiency, cutting out bloat. I'm wondering if that's something limiting or imposing fiscal restraints. Is that one of the
Absolutely.
ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. As long as an amendment falls within that subject area, fiscal restraints, I would say yes. Any fiscal restraint would make a government more efficient.
I don't know if I agree with that statement.
I see your point. Maybe I misstated what I meant. I think trying to make, say, an amendment to make government more efficient, I think was your idea, efficiencies. I think that would certainly fall under that subject area.
Okay. I was just curious. Thank
It may depend on the exact nature of the proposed amendment. Any other questions? Okay. So again, that's more of the nuts and bolts of the process. There's an interesting argument that, if you haven't heard of it, you probably will hear of it, and that is that there were problems with the initial Constitutional Convention. And there are people who claim that the delegates there didn't follow their instructions. And Convention of States has opponents, by the way, in case you didn't know that. There are groups of people who oppose what we're doing. And that's one of their arguments, is that the original Constitution, when it was adopted, when it was created, the framers who created it didn't follow their instructions, according to some of our opponents. And that's actually a false claim. The historical record does show that the delegates to our Constitutional Convention did follow their state instructions. Speaking of our opponents, the more we progress and have progressed over these past few years, the more we've drawn out opponents to what we're doing. There's a number of groups that have, by name, have made themselves heard and voiced their opposition to what we're doing. A lot of them are largely based on fear of what we're doing. There's never been an Article 5 convention yet in our nation's history. So naturally, there's going to be fear about anything that's never been done before. And I believe, and a lot of us believe, that our opponents are by and large operating out of a fear mode. They won't admit that, and they put up other reasons for their opposition, that the delegates didn't follow their instructions and things like that. They also will claim that our convention will run away and go out of control. That's another one of their claims. That's another false claim. There's, as I was mentioning, there are safeguards, like the requirement of 38 states to ratify the legislation that requires delegates to stay within their instructions. That's another safeguard. It's virtually impossible, given the environment, given the stipulations in Article 5, it's virtually impossible to have a runaway Article 5 convention. What is much more apparent, though, is our current Congress is kind of operating as a runaway Congress with our federal debt and our unfunded liabilities. That's where the real runaway thing is happening. And we're trying to do something about that. We have a constitution-based solution that the framers gave us unanimously, again, as I mentioned. This is a kind of an unmined gold that's never been mined before out of the earth, but it's there for us to use. And it's very apparent from what the framers wrote and is recorded in history that they wanted this to be used when needed. And now is the time to use it. This is the time it's needed now. one of the reasons that we do these talks is not just to raise awareness about what we're doing and educate people about what we're doing, but to recruit new people. Being a grassroots movement, the lifeblood of our organization is growing our ranks and getting new people, especially young people. So that's one of the reasons that I'm here. We're hoping that not to take you from Turning Point USA, but to have you join us also. You can do both. You can be part of more than one organization, obviously. We have a youth portion of our project, Young Americans for a Convention of States, which includes an internship program. Some great young people in this program across the nation. Actually, Mark Meckler's daughter, Lucy Meckler, is a student at Hillsdale College, and she, I think early this year or late last year, started the first ever chapter of Citizens for Self-Governance at Hillsdale College. First chapter anywhere in the nation, but it's at Hillsdale College. Lucy's terrific. She's spoken publicly, and she's great, like her dad, a real great force, great dynamic public speaker. By the way, we're having an event with Mark Meckler next month in New Jersey at Rider University on November 26th, which is a Monday. You're welcome to join us. So please do. We'll help you get set up for that. We have a registration online for that. Admission is free. Bring friends, bring other group members. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Two questions. One, or well, I'll say one first. So it seems to me, maybe I'm misunderstanding this project, but one of your goals, so three like focus areas, right? So fiscal restraints, sort of the term limit stuff, and then sort of like limiting the federal government's power, right? To me, that maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but that seems to be like an idea to devolve some of the federal government's power to the states. Am I understanding that correctly? You're
understanding that correctly. Part of the base of this project is to I'm glad you asked that. That's an excellent question, and that's something I mean to talk about when I do these talks. Is our aim in getting the federal government under control is to rebalance power on a vertical basis. We all familiar with the balance of power horizontally, the three branches, executive, legislative, and judicial is kind of a horizontal balance of power, checks and balances. The framers also had in mind a vertical balance of power between the federal government and the states. And that's, the framers called that federalism. It's frequently referred to as federalism. It's also closely tied in with that is the concept of self-governance, meaning the everyday American person takes responsibility, individual responsibility, for how their nation is governed. It doesn't mean that we are totally taking power from the federal government and leaving it with none. We're taking some, rebalancing, as was intended by the framers. And again, we know that the framers intended this by their writings, by the Constitution that they created. The historical record shows that. The 10th Amendment, for example, familiar with the 10th Amendment, how it says that any power not enumerated to the federal government is reserved to the states. That's another thing that we are hoping maybe can come out of the convention is an amendment to put some teeth into that, to make it stronger, to clarify it in explicit language so that it cannot be finagled and misinterpreted.
So my follow-up, I guess, is maybe I'm sort of misunderstanding what your motive is here, but so the argument is that Congress is sort of out of control and sort of is not representative of people's interests or whatever. It's not working to the interests. But I don't know, but my fear is that like by devolving power to state legislatures themselves are subject to the same problems that Congress itself faces.
It's another excellent point. Another excellent point. But what, in response to that, I would say that yes, state lawmakers they're human also, just like congressmen, and they have the same human frailties. They can be corrupted by power like congressmen can. They're susceptible to corruption. But the important thing here is that state lawmakers are more accountable to people, the everyday person, because they're closer. If you've ever tried to contact your congressman, good luck with that. Very few people are ever able to get through to even their office. I've never even gotten I don't think I've ever gotten anyone to answer the phone at a congressman's office, much less talk to the congressman. But at your state lawmaker, you can get access to your state lawmaker without a lot of problem, without a lot of trouble. You can get a meeting with them, talk to them on the phone, which I've done, a lot of my colleagues have done across the nation. So the idea is that they're more accountable to us. And it's a great point you bring up, though, because growing this grassroots army, which is, and it's another thing that you helped me to remember, is the mission of Convention of States. Convention of States has a formal stated mission, which is to grow a grassroots army of citizen activists across the nation. It's not a military army. It's not a violent army. It's an army of people who are fighting to restore liberty and restore constitutional adherence, get the federal government under control. Growing that grassroots army results in a lot of political power. When you have, in numbers, there's strength. So there's a lot of political power there that's developed as we're doing this process of growing the grassroots army. And that power can be used to influence state lawmakers to pass our application in each of the states, to have our convention, and then to get amendments that are needed, the structural change that's needed. So it's a matter of power is really at the base of this issue. Where the power is, who has it, and then you could put it in this terms, a simple question, who decides, right? Power has to do with who makes the decisions. And our position is that the framers made their thoughts on that very clearly with 3 words at the start of the Constitution. We the people. It's our contention that the framers strictly meant that the people of America should have the ultimate power. Not all of the power doesn't mean, having no federal government, but it means the power is based with the American people. In fact, that's kind of the definition of a republic. The power resides with the people who elect representatives to represent them. Sure.
I heard this argument the other day that we live in such a hyper-connected society, the internet, where things like the Constitution as an old dead document, the need for it is called into question, and especially when it comes to representative republic. Devil's advocate, so I'm wondering what you.
Yeah. That's a great question, too. It's our position that the Constitution is based on timeless principles, and it's that it was inspired by what was called natural law, which included rights, inalienable rights that man has from nature, or as some say, from God. Some say, instead of saying from nature. And those rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, for example, some secondary rights that kind of revolve around those core rights. And this, this idea about the old dead document, we really oppose that thinking because of these timeless principles that it enshrines, that are enshrined in the Constitution. And that is opposed to the idea of a living, breathing document that kind of gives rise to the idea of, well, we can change the Constitution to suit what we think it should say, and almost like a whimsical kind of a standard. What was the second part of you? You were saying, okay, so now.
Just like, oh yeah, the document part, but also like. Connected, who we really need.
Yes, the democracy.
Yeah.
You mentioned did you use the phrase
Mass democracy, yeah.
Yeah, mass democracy. That there's a pure democracy.
Yeah,
Like digital democracy.
Yeah,
the new
yeah.
one,
The framers of the Constitution, and our nation was founded also on the idea of being a republic, and which, as opposed to a pure democracy, which a pure democracy is majority rule. And the problem with majority rule is that it can become a tyranny to the minority. So the framers addressed that by setting up this variant of a democracy called a representative republic or a democratic republic to prevent that tyranny of the minority, prevent the majority from dominating the minority. And that has served us quite well. That system of government has served us well by and large. That system is in large part the reason that America has become the greatest nation on earth. Although, as I said, as we talked about, we're getting away from that gradually over the last 100, 120 years, very unfortunately. So, but we're trying to do something about that. Again, that's part and parcel of the Convention of States project. Yes, sir.
This is a question, so that comes completely out of ignorance. How much support do you have, sort of, among state legislatures, state legislators, whatever? Like, what is sort of numerically like? What?
Very good question. And I was meaning to get to that, and you helped me along. We've done very well in the 5 years. 12 states have passed our application for an Article 5 convention. And I'll tell you those 5 states, and this is in chronological order from first to last. Georgia, Alaska, Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, Indiana, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Missouri is the 12th and most recent. Yeah. We're working on those states. We're active in all 50 states. Yes, Alaska Pass is number 2. Yeah, Georgia, then Alaska, and number 2.
How'd you guys get Florida?
Well, that's a good question too. I have to say I can't really give you a full authoritative answer on that, but I do know we have had a real strong team there in Florida, and I have to give them credit as far as I know that strong team that we have has got that passed in Florida, the 3rd state to pass the application. Which I think was in 2014 is when Florida passed, maybe 2015.
Maybe you don't know off the top of your head, but like, what does support for the, like, in states besides these 12? Right?
Okay.
Like, what is it like? Are there legislators in every state that support it? Are some states close to majority? Like, what's the last?
You get the gold star for best questions. I have to say, and I really appreciate it. So I was going to say, over 3.6 million Americans now support Convention of States across the nation, and that's represented by petition signatures Also on social media, how they've indicated their support in various ways on social media. And that number is growing, by the way. On average, that is 2,000 new supporters per day. If you do the quick math, that it shows you in 5 years, 3.6 million people. And I think that rate is actually increasing now. So your question was support.
And among the legislators.
Among the legislators, right. Very good. Obviously, we need legislator support from lawmakers of all political parties. We can't just do this with one political party. Convention of States is nonpartisan. We reach out to people of all political persuasions. So in many states, we do have Democrat lawmakers who sponsor our resolution, and that's how it works. In the state legislatures, the lawmakers sponsor this bill and that bill. So I've put together my own list of about 10 states where we have Democrat lawmaker sponsors as well as Republican lawmakers. For example, Ohio, Indiana, and in Indiana, our primary sponsor, no, I'm sorry, Illinois. In Illinois, our primary sponsor is a Democrat, which is quite remarkable. In Hawaii, all of our sponsors are Democrats. In fact, I think all the state lawmakers in Hawaii are Democrats. I think New Hampshire, I think we have Democrat sponsors in New Hampshire. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's an important thing, though, is to have that broad base of support, and something that we work on also. The Convention of States Project's position is that what we're doing at its base should appeal to all Americans. To get the federal government to adhere to the Constitution as it was originally intended, that's something all Americans should get behind. Also to get the fiscal problems under control. Again, that's something all Americans really should get behind, because we're heading for a collapse of this house of cards that we're building. And it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. It's unsustainable. History tells us that former great republics have collapsed. There's no country that's too big to fail. In other words, no republic that's too big to fail. And we're doing a lot of the same things, really, that the Roman Republic did with debt and virtue. That's virtue is another part of this process, and part of self-governance is, the framers talked about this, that to be a self-governing people required people to have a level of virtue. To have freedom and liberty also required virtue. You can't have freedom and liberty without possessing virtue, also to meet your own responsibilities. Right? When you draw power back to the states and the people, that carries with it a responsibility also, to use that power responsibly. So virtue is very much a part of this whole issue. That's basically what I wanted to talk about. Yeah. Went on for a while.
One final question.
Sure.
I mean, I don't mean to burden any of the
Yeah.
So you talked, so in terms of your three projects.
Subject areas.
Yeah, subject areas. Three subject areas. So the one, I mean, maybe this is something that's just simply not laid out yet, and it's just sort of a big point at the end. So it's pretty straightforward to me what, fiscal response probably means something like a balanced budget amendment. Like vertical balance, like term limits, okay, that's pretty straightforward. But what do you specifically have in mind for the first one, sort of limiting federal power? Like, what are the sort of, talk about devolution to state legislatures. What is the specific manifestation of that in terms of structures and institutions?
One could be a clarification of the Commerce Clause, for example. It could also be a clarification of the General Welfare Clause, also in Article 1, Section 8. Another possibility, one that Mark Levin proposed, was that to give the states the power to overturn certain Supreme Court decisions, again, with a standard, a high bar standard to meet to do it, but that was something that Mark Levin proposed in his book, Liberty Amendments. So that would be an example of limiting the power of the federal government, the Supreme Court, actually, in that case.
State legislatures would be able to.
In some limited cases, yeah. If that such an amendment were passed. Check and balance. Check and balance, exactly. And it's a good point. This idea of balancing power has very much to do with, it's very closely tied to corruption. Corruption, we know, feeds off of power. So the idea, and this was the framers' intent, was to spread out and balance power to avoid corruption, to counteract that corrupting influence of power. A lot of people are concerned about money in politics, in the federal government. Well, a lot of that is fed by the centralizing of power, which attracts that money. So by drawing some power and spreading it out more, you counteract that corrupting influence and reduce the appeal of that people have to throw money at congressmen. If congressmen have less power, there's less attraction there to throw money at them to get what you want.
Turn down the lobbyists by the lobbyists go after what they're
Yeah,
taking the power.
yeah,
Okay.
Not to mention
Yeah, the term
exactly.
reduce career politicians.
We did a presentation to a town council. I think it was January this year, maybe December, in Washington Township. And we wanted to do the presentation and then get them to vote on it and hopefully pass, vote yes on our resolution. And then we would use that to maybe get more town councils to vote yes on our. So I happened to go there and I videotaped that. And I'll never forget, one of the councilwomen said, she brought up her concern that that she thought the Koch brothers were funding Convention of States. Yeah, yeah.
money.
And not only is that not true, and then Mark Meckler, I've heard him say that in person, that the Koch brothers do not fund Convention of States. He said he's still waiting for their check to let them know if you're talking to them. But nevertheless, this woman had done some research and printed out some research that she did at home saying that the Koch brothers fund Convention of States. And so I wasn't in a position to speak to her that night, but what I would have told her was, if that's really a big concern for you, taking some power away from congressmen will fight that. Because her idea was that the Koch brothers also buy off congressmen also for their interests. So, should we? Okay. Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you all for
You're very welcome. Thank you very much. Thank you.